Hello, welcome to the IESD for this conference dedicated to UK and Poland defense relationship, especially after Brexit. We are welcoming today a Polish researcher that is working in UK, so it's the best place to speak about this matter. It's Aleks Szczerbiak, and he's going to talk to us about this defense relationship that is evolving very rapidly. The conference will also be animated by Oli First, our young researcher. First, we are going to hear Mr. Szczerbiak, and then we'll have some question with our researcher and with the attendants. Mr. Szczerbiak, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invite. It's a great pleasure to be here. I don't know whether I count as Polish or British for these purposes. I'm Polish originally, but I'm based in the UK. But there is a joke that presentations by British academics always begin with an apology. Okay, so for these purposes, I'm going to be British, and my apology is that I'm not, and as I pointed this out to Oli, I'm not a specialist in security issues, particularly not military security. I'm primarily a specialist in Polish politics, and I'm also, I don't research bilateral relations between Poland and the UK, but obviously the fact that I live in the UK means that I pay a lot of attention and spend a lot of time talking to people in the British Foreign Office and also in the Polish government. It means that I can't sort of avoid it, really. I do have a bit of a handle on bilateral relations, and as we shall see in a moment, and I'm sure you know, the military dimension is very, very important to that. So I say I'm not a military specialist. I don't research bilateral relations. It's Polish, but some people say I don't even know anything about Polish politics either, but I'll do my best on that one. So that's my kind of health warning, if you like, apology at the beginning. So what I want to look at is really four different things. I'm going to start by looking at how UK-Polish relations really changed after 2015, after the current government led by the right-wing Law and Justice Party took office. And then the second thing I want to look at is how did those relations then evolve after Britain voted to leave the European Union, after the Brexit referendum and as the process of Brexit unfolded and obviously culminated towards the end of 2020. The third thing I want to look at is how those relations, Polish-UK relations, have developed, particularly after the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then finally, I want to pull together the various threads, try and draw some conclusions, and have a little think about sort of future prospects and perspectives. You know, how might things develop, and what would be what are the kind of the drivers, if you like, of future bilateral relations. Okay, so that's what I'm going to look at. That's as good as it gets, I'm afraid. So let's start by looking at UK-Polish relations since 2015. Now when it came to office in autumn 2015, after the parliamentary elections, Polish Law and Justice Party pledged to fairly radically reconfigure, reorientate Polish foreign policy, and in particular in terms of Poland's relations with the EU, with the European Union. The strategy, the EU strategy pursued by the previous government, by its predecessor, led by the liberal centrist Civic Platform Party, currently Poland's main opposition grouping, led by Donald Tusk, who all of you probably will know, probably the best known Polish politician in Europe, if not the world. The strategy of its predecessor was to try and advance Poland's interests within the EU by locating the country as much as possible within what you might call the European mainstream. Okay. In other words, by building as close relations as possible with the main EU powers. So here we're obviously talking about the Franco-German axis and especially Berlin, Germany. And Law and Justice was very, very critical of this approach and argued that Poland instead needed to be much more assertive in terms of its relations with the main EU powers and to build what it called its own stream. Okay, so rather than trying to locate itself within the mainstream, it had to build its own stream as a kind of counter to the Franco-German axis. And most of this involved and still involves trying to develop close relations with other post-communist Central and East European states through international cooperation platforms such as the Visegrad Group with Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary, and much more broadly with a much wider range of post-communist states, the so-called 3Cs initiative. Okay. However, originally, at least, a key element of that reorientation of trying to build its own stream in opposition to or as a counter to the mainstream was envisaged as a much closer relationship between Poland and the UK. Okay, indeed, in the first kind of major policy speech by the Polish Foreign Secretary, the Law and Justice Foreign Secretary, Witold Waszczykowski, in January, I think it was, 2016, so very shortly after they came to power, he made a speech and he set out Poland's, or the new government's foreign policy priorities, and he actually singled out the UK, which he said would be Poland's main EU ally. Okay, no, rather than Germany, Poland's main EU ally would be the UK. And in many ways, this is not surprising because Law and Justice and the British Conservative Party were kind of long-standing close allies. They were the founders and were the key members of the European Conservatives and Reformists group within the European Parliament. There were a lot of differences between the two of them. I mean, in a nutshell, the British Conservatives are much more liberal, if you like, both socially and economically. So socially on kind of moral cultural issues, the British Conservative Party is much more liberal, but it's also much more free market. Okay, so it's much more liberal economically. So there are key differences. In terms of EU affairs, this often sort of manifested itself in the fact that the UK, as a net contributor, wanted to cut the EU budget, whereas Poland, as the largest beneficiary, wanted big fiscal transfers. But a lot of the time, they were able to find areas of common interest. Okay, I mean, within the EU, for example, they were both in favor of extending the single market, although they had different views in terms of state intervention in the economy. Both of them wanted to extend the single market to include services. For example, they were both very strongly Atlanticist. Okay, so both of them are very the British Conservatives and Polish Law and Justice Party were very strongly in favor of developing powerful transatlantic relationships with the USA, which in terms of defense cooperation meant, for example, that although both of them were in favor of the EU developing a stronger defense identity, it wasn't to be as an alternative to NATO and to the transatlantic partnership. Rather, it was seen as complementary, as a mechanism of trying to get European states like Germany to spend more money on the military. Okay, and as a complement to the US involvement in Western military security and as a strong NATO, not as an alternative to it. And critically, both countries had a very critical approach to Russia, to Moscow. So they had a very similar approach to what the EU's Eastern policy, which was that it should be adopt a kind of a tough, assertive, robust response, sanctions following the 2014 conflict in Ukraine should be as strong as possible. There needs to be as much energy independence from Moscow as possible, and that the bloc needs to, and the EU needs to, and the West more generally needs to remain as united as possible. So they were very opposed to, particularly the major EU powers, France and Germany, developing bilateral relations with Moscow over the heads, if you like, of the post-communist states and outside of the structures of the Western international community. And both Law and Justice and the Conservative Party, the British Conservative Party, were also strongly anti-federalist in terms of their vision of how European integration should develop. Okay. And pragmatically, both of them, as large EU states, but neither of them kind of quite at the center of power within the European Union. Britain, because Britain is, I mean, there was always this phrase about Britain being an awkward partner, the EU. Poland, because, well, the problem Poland always had was that it was a big country, but it was kind of quite weak economically, okay, which made it difficult to kind of punch its way. So both of them had an interest in challenging the hegemony, although for somewhat different reasons, the hegemony of the Franco-German axis. Okay. So, as I say, at one point, Britain was to be Poland's main EU ally. Okay, and this is not surprising because Law and Justice and the British Conservative Party have for a long time had very, very close relations. They work very closely together. There's key differences between them on lots of issues, but also in terms of certain critical issues, both within the EU when Britain was a member, and more generally, particularly in relation to Eastern policy relations with Moscow and Atlanticism, going beyond EU matters. However, 6 months later, this wonderful strategy, this great idea of Britain being Poland's main EU ally, was completely blown out of the water. It was stillborn, okay, because in less than 6 months after Witold Waszczykowski makes this speech in the Polish Parliament in January 2016, in June 2016, Britain votes to leave the European Union. Okay, so Brexit, if you like, in EU terms, scuppers this nascent strategic partnership. So in EU terms, this obviously meant that Poland had to kind of pursue other options, if you like, in terms of building alliances. I mean, I could talk about this, but this is a whole other topic, really, and it's not really germane to the key thing we're interested in, which is the British-Polish partnership. So it's a great problem. Obviously, you know, Britain can't be its main EU ally if it's not going to be an EU member. Nonetheless, both countries remained strongly committed to maintaining and indeed even strengthening bilateral relations. Okay, in spite of the fact that Britain was leaving the EU. Now, in Poland's case, a key driver of this was the large Polish community in the UK, okay, which has grown hugely, obviously, since Polish accession to the EU in 2014. The UK, unlike virtually every other West European state, with the exception, I think, of Ireland and Sweden, completely opened up its labour market to people from the post-communist states. There was no transition period was used, which was obviously used in other countries, Spain, France, Germany, the other sort of destinations where Poles might go. As a result of which, at its peak, there were about 1 million Poles, okay, living in Britain, a very large number, 1 million Poles, all of, the great bulk of whom arrived after 2014. Before 2014, there would have been about, I don't know, 150,000 or something like that. Poles. These were all people like, basically people of my parents' generation who arrived after the Second World War. Now that number's gone down a bit. It's largely as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, because as a result of the restrictions that were introduced, the lockdown restrictions, the kind of areas where Poles worked, so kind of hospitality, construction, I mean, these were the areas where tourism, these were the areas which obviously couldn't function as a result of the restrictions. So a lot of Poles just decided to go home. And if you're going to be sitting around the house, you might as well sit around the house at home in Poland rather than in Britain. At least you're close to your family. But nonetheless, there's still about 700, 800,000 Poles still living in the UK. They're still the largest ethnic minority in Poland, and Polish is the second language after English that's spoken. And in Polish terms, they are hugely politically significant. Okay, hugely politically significant. Not necessarily because all these people, vote in an election. Actually, most of these people don't vote. The numbers who vote is fewer than 100,000, really, or around about that number. The reason is because everybody has somebody in their family or in their friends in Poland. Everybody has somebody who's living and working in the UK. Okay, and therefore, what happens to the Polish community in Britain is incredibly important for Polish politics. Okay, when the Brexit negotiations were going on, when the treaty to withdraw Britain from the UK, the Polish government viewed these negotiations almost exclusively through the prism of the Polish community in the UK and what would happen to them. What would be their position? Would they still retain all the rights that they had before, while Britain was a full EU member? Okay, so it's hugely politically significant. So for Poland, Britain remains important because you've got this huge kind of Polish community in Britain, which, as I say, is hugely politically important, which means obviously bilateral relations are very, very important. On the UK side, so this is interesting because strengthening Polish-British bilateral relations were part of a broader effort that the government made to kind of upgrade or develop stronger ties, stronger bilateral ties with European states more generally. Okay, the argument being that while we're members of the EU, Britain this is, while we're members of the EU, a lot of our relations are mediated on key policy areas through the European Union. Okay, and therefore, bilateral relations are less important. Once we leave the EU, okay, we'll have to negotiate a lot and agree a lot of these things directly with those countries concerned. And therefore, we need to pay a lot more attention to our bilateral relations. We need to boost our capacity in terms of bilateral relations. Interestingly, in terms of academic capacity as well, I remember for years being a country specialist has been, it's really kind of gone out of fashion really in British academia. I don't know what the situation is like in France, but unless you're a specialist in Britain, the USA, Russia, Germany, China, and France, incidentally, you can get away with France as well. It's very unfashionable being a single, and suddenly, as a result of which, there's been a real decline in them. And suddenly, the British Foreign Office said, "Where on earth are all these single? We need people who know stuff about, all these countries, not just the big ones." So, there was a real kind of investment in bilateral relations more generally, and particularly in countries that were seen as either strategically very important or politically very significant. Okay, and Poland was certainly the latter, and as I'm going to explain in a minute, in terms of certainly since the outbreak of the conflict, has been strategically very important as well, but it was always very politically sympathetic. There were good relations already for the reasons I've explained, between the British Conservatives and the Law and Justice Party, and therefore they wanted to invest in making these relations even better. Okay, in a country that's already, theoretically at least, Poland's ally. And there was a lot of investment in this, both kind of diplomatically, at governmental level, and also at civil society level. So, for example, there's an initiative called the Belvedere Forum, which is, it's an attempt to develop, it's a sort of platform for civil society cooperation between Poland and the UK. And rhetorically, at least, both governments put a lot of effort into this. There's a big kind of annual forum, big conference that takes place once in Poland, once in the UK. I've been to most of these over the last 6 years they've been going. Okay, so that is so that's what happened after Britain voted to leave the EU. What's been the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on all of this? Well, I don't need to tell you that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the conflict, has done a number of things in terms of international politics and national politics in many countries. I mean, the first thing is it's obviously moved international security, especially military security, right to the top of the political agenda. It's also moved Eastern policy, especially relations with Russia, to the top of the international European policy agenda. Okay, and by moving those two things up the policy agenda, this has hugely strengthened bilateral, already quite good bilateral relations between Poland and the UK. Okay, it's really kind of boosted them. Now, one of the reasons why Poland was so keen to maintain close bilateral relations with the UK, part of it's obviously to do with the Polish community in the UK, the diaspora, the million or 700 or 800,000 Poles. But another reason is because the UK, from the Polish perspective, is seen as a credible and reliable military partner. Okay, a credible and reliable military partner. As a consequence of which both sides were very committed to closer military cooperations. This has been one of the most fruitful areas of cooperation between Poland and the UK. And the credibility and reliability are critical here. And the fact that they're both encompassed from the Polish point of view in one player. There are, the UK and Poland both shared, as I said, a similar analysis of the nature of Vladimir Putin's Russian regime. Both of them, as I said, warned about, cozying up to this regime. This is an aggressive, expansionist regime that required a kind of a united and very robust response by the Western international community. Now, there were, of course, other, European states that had a similar analysis. Okay, so from Poland's point of view, they were reliable, okay, because they had the same analysis. They just weren't very credible militarily. It doesn't really matter that the Baltic states are on exactly the same page as Poland, in terms of their analysis of the Putin regime, because the Baltic states militarily, are not that helpful, really. They're kind of, they're recipients, they're consumers, if you like, of security rather than producers of security. They're just not credible as military actors. There's other countries that are credible as military actors. France, for example, highly credible. It's a serious military from the point of view of Britain. Germany is not very credible in terms of the military from the Polish point of view, but politically is really important, okay, both within the European Union and also, well, until recently, in terms of relations with the US. Okay, so France in particular is credible, okay, just not very reliable from a Polish point of view. It's felt to be too keen to develop close bilateral relations with Moscow over the heads of post-communist states like Poland and indeed Ukraine, of course. So this is the key thing about Britain from the kind of the Polish perspective. It is both credible and reliable. And there's very few countries that kind of fall into that category. The United States is about the only other one, okay, that is both credible and reliable. So, you know, when military security, when Eastern relations move to the top of the agenda, then those relations are going to intensify. And from Britain's point of view, of course, Poland, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, has also become absolutely critical in terms of European security. It's the kind of the key frontline state in terms of the conflict with Russia. It's the key, you know, hub in terms of providing military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It's also the key country through which refugees fleeing the conflict are coming. Over 3 million refugees have passed through Poland. Not all of them obviously have stayed there, but, you know, have passed through Poland. So from Britain's point of view, Poland has become a key strategic ally in terms of the West's relationship with Moscow, simply because of where it is geographically, and also because of, you know, its size, and potentially because of its military. As a consequence of which, we've seen a real intensification of the relationship over the last few months, particularly in the military dimension. And I don't need to tell you about this. You know, there are, I'm sure you'll know about this stuff better than I will, or indeed, I'm sure there's probably one of the great things about the internet is, you know, people can join you from all over the world. There's probably people on this call that know much more about these things. But, you know, I'm just simply looking at some of the news stories from recent months, things like, you know, the kind of military contracts that have been signed between Poland and the UK over things like, you know, the CAM, the Common Anti-Air Modular Missile, and the role that's going to play in sort of Poland's short-range air defense system, the NAREW. You've got British frigates, you've got British Type 31 frigates, which Poland is purchasing. You've got the Challenger tanks, which are going to be replacing, or the plan is to replace the T-72s that Poland is going to be sending over to the Ukraine. In some cases, you know, these are huge armed forces contracts. You know, some of the biggest alongside the F-35s that Poland is you know, purchasing from the US. And alongside this, you've obviously got the sidelining of French and German companies from other countries. Now, obviously, there are kind of, you know, technical elements to all of this. You know, you don't just buy technology, you know, arms purchases purely for political reasons. The kit has got to work, basically, and it's got to be effective, and it's got to fit into your, you know, military strategy. But equally, you know, I mean, again, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, you know, military purchases are never purely about technology. Okay, there are strong political elements about this. So the strengthening military cooperation between Poland and England, which is, you know, the UK, which is really critical now. It's kind of, you know, it's really at another level. I mean, you know, a diplomatic event between Poland and the UK will have military there now. You know, any sort of general diplomatic event that's attended in terms of the bilateral, you know, there'll be people there in uniform, you know. It's an absolutely critical, but the political elements to it are incredibly important as well. It's not simply about technology, because these British companies produce the kit that fits as well. Again, I'm sure I don't need to tell you this. Okay, so let's sort of try and pull all this together and have some thoughts about the future. How might this play out? So, sort of three conclusions. I mean, Brexit meant that, conclusion number one, Brexit meant that Poland had to abandon its attempts to kind of build a strategic partnership with the UK as its main EU ally, the idea of it as a sort of a counter lobby to the Franco-German axis, to the European mainstream. However, conclusion two, both sides are committed, were committed, whatever happened regarding Brexit, to maintaining, strengthening bilateral relations. Indeed, arguably, bilateral relations for the UK are actually stronger. Okay, they're actually more important now than they were when Poland was in the EU. Okay, because it was part of a broader effort to improve bilateral links with strategically important or politically sympathetic countries like Poland, which, you know, for the reasons I've set out, was always the case. And thirdly, conclusion number 3, the two countries are strongly committed to developing close relations in terms of military cooperation, especially in terms of deterrence against Russian aggression. And because the Ukrainian war, because of, you know, where Poland is geopolitically, has moved relations to security issues to the top of the, you know, international European politics, to the top of the political agenda, this has really intensified British-Polish relations. Okay, and if you ask a diplomat now, okay, if you ask a Polish or British diplomat to tell you about the state of Polish-UK relations, their answer will be about military relations. Okay, or their first answer will be about military relations. This wasn't the case 6 months ago. Okay, it's really made a difference. So how is this going to play out? Well, obviously, it really depends on the kind of the course of the war. And to what extent it's a game changer. I mean, are we talking about something that's going to permanently upgrade and lead to ever closer relations, or is it something that could fade, either because there's, you know, the conflict ends in some kind of peace settlement, or becomes some kind of, you know, frozen conflict, either in the sense that there is a peace settlement but not really a satisfactory one, or it continues but, you know, becomes something that's really sort of followed by people who are really interested in wars or are interested in, you know, Eastern Europe or something like that. But in terms of the kind of media, ceases to become a major story, you know, or is it a game changer? You know, is it a geopolitical moment that's really kind of, you know, realigning things? Well, I think there are strong reasons to suspect that it could be a game changer in terms of both countries. I mean, in terms of Poland, definitely. I mean, you know, absolutely no doubt about this. I mean, you know, security, military security, this is going to be a top issue in Poland for, you know, foreseeable, certainly up to the next Polish election, which is scheduled for autumn 2023. Okay, no, very little doubt about that. I mean, I watch Polish news every night. It's one of the, you know, top, if not the top story, it's one of the, you know, top 2 or 3 stories and what's happening in Ukraine. In Britain, I mean, obviously it's kind of moved down the agenda, but you know, I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which the British government, as long as it's a Conservative government, is kind of invested in this quite heavily. And indeed, I mean, you know, surprisingly, I don't know whether you get this in France, but I mean, one of the things that surprises me is, you know, I kind of walk down my street, I actually see Ukrainian flags. You know, people are flying Ukrainian flags, and still, you know, now, I mean, this is not just you know, immediately afterwards. So I mean, you know, I think there's reasons to believe that actually this could have a lasting impact on British-Polish relations, and certainly from the Polish point of view, you know, military security is going to be, you know, right up there. What are the possible counter tendencies to this? I think there are a couple. I think that in Poland, I think one of the issues here is the way that the policy making in terms of international relations and bilateral relations is fragmented. Okay, now why is that a problem? It's a problem because the Defence Ministry wants really close relations with the UK. Okay, as does the political leadership of the governing camp. Okay, so, you know, the political leadership of Law and Justice, and I would also say the Foreign Office as well. The problem here is that the Foreign Office can't really make this count, okay, because the Foreign Office is actually quite weak, really, in Polish terms, politically, and the political leadership, for whom it's very important, is also interested in other things, like, you know, the cost of living and, you know, all the kind of day-to-day politics. Okay, I mean, the Defence Ministry is really important in this, but the Defence Ministry isn't the only player, and a really important player in this. There are elements within the Polish government that are kind of less committed to the bilateral relationship. Okay, a really important one here is the Ministry of European Affairs. Okay, the Ministry of European Affairs in Poland is much more Europhile, okay, and tends to view Britain through a kind of a Brexit lens or an EU lens, if you like. You know, they're much less sympathetic to kind of developing relations with Britain separately and bilaterally, and they're much, I mean, it's because of, you know, where these people come from, where they were kind of socialized, who they mix with. Okay, I mean, the Minister of European Affairs in Poland, a chap called Konrad Szymański. I mean, I met Konrad Szymański 20 years ago, and he was, you know, a very Eurosceptic, you know, right-wing conservative politician. He then got elected to the European Parliament. He spent 10 years in the European Parliament, and in many ways, he's kind of, you know, probably the most Europhile member of the Polish government. And they play quite an important role. And they're also quite well connected in policy terms with the Prime Minister's office. Okay. In a way that, say, the foreign ministry isn't. Okay, they don't have that. I mean, Konrad Szymański, for example, really has a lot of clout in terms of Poland's EU policy, more than the foreign ministry, I would say, ironically, even though he's, you know, theoretically a more junior minister. In British terms, well, on the UK side, again, there are elements that, you know, really strongly want to push for close relations. So I would say the people here are the defence establishment. Okay, obviously, you know, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to work out why. You know, money talks. You know, big money contracts will make a lot of difference. And people at the political leadership. Okay, so the political leadership of, again, like, you know, the political leadership of Law and Justice wants close relations. So does the political leadership of the Conservative Party, because, you know, again, they see them as kind of ideological allies. And then what I would call the pragmatic diplomats. Okay, so these are the people in, you know, the Foreign Office or in you know, ministries who pragmatically just want good diplomatic relations with countries that they think are strategically important, you know, or politically. So there's not a political motivation here, it's strategic important. The counterweight to this is there are some elements, particularly within the sort of public administration in Britain, who are quite hostile to close relations with Poland. And the reason for this is that they're ideologically quite hostile. And in particular, they're very concerned about the kind of issues that the EU raises, or the EU political establishment raises, on things like rule of law, or on kind of moral cultural issues. So this is things like, you know, multiculturalism, the legal recognition of same-sex couples, abortion, you know, these kind of issues. I mean, they're very concerned about these things. They think that, you know, that they're really concerned about the fact that the Law and Justice Party stands outside the European sort of liberal left, if you like, mainstream on a lot of these issues, and also they also accept the narrative of the opposition and Poland's legal establishment that you know, Poland's reforms in things like the judiciary have violated the rule of law, and they think that Britain should be more robust about this. Okay, and they think that you shouldn't simply because Poland is kind of, you know, politically useful, strategically useful, you shouldn't downplay those particular issues, and therefore they want to bring issues like that to the fore, and the more they do that, the more that annoys the Polish government, basically. So, you know, every time that, I don't know, a British ambassador goes on, I don't know, LGBT march or something in Warsaw or something like that, this is fantastically annoying, you know, for the Polish government, and really, you know, undermines the position of those who want bilateral relations. So that's you know, a not insignificant lobby, but I would say the main lobby in the British government, certainly while, you know, the current Conservative administration in power are, you know, it's the defence establishment, the political leadership of the Conservative Party, and the pragmatic diplomats really prioritise things like, you know, security and political relations over questions like, you know, the rule of law and you know, moral cultural issues. Okay, that's me done. And I'm happy to answer your, I hope that was of some interest, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Szczerbiak. I have one question which came off the two opposing axes of the European Union at the time. So kind of, you were saying you had Germany and France on one side, and then the Poland and Britain aligning themselves on the other side. I wanted to ask, when the UK left the European Union, where did Poland turn then in terms of how much did that impact their ability to influence combined defense policy in Europe? I think recently the Polish government have made the commitment to increasing their defense spending to 3% of their GDP. That recently came out. So yeah, I just wondered, after the UK's withdrawal, where did Poland turn? And of course, at the moment, everyone is agreed on the main military issue, but where do they see themselves aligning now?
Okay, so after the UK left the EU, they basically had to kind of return to or place greater emphasis on the strategy of trying to build close relations with the post-communist states through things like the Visegrad Group and the Three Seas initiative. So these were the kind of, the key forums that they tried to use for leverage. I mean, as an aside, they did also, and they have also been trying to strengthen their relations with certain kind of right-wing Eurosceptic parties, some of whom they're in a common group within the European Parliament, but others they're not. I mean, for the French case, the most notable example will be the Marine Le Pen in terms of the French National Front, who had leaders with the Polish Prime Minister and came to a major conference in Warsaw. But the problem with that is that most of these were not governing parties really, except for Viktor Orban's Hungary, and they had a relationship with him anyway through. That's a post-communist state, and anyway, that relationship is now in crisis. So that was really part of a kind of a longer-term project. So I mean, the key focus really was with working with other post-communist states. Now, the problem here is that a lot of those post-communist states also pursued their EU strategy was also based on being ingratiating themselves with the European mainstream. Okay, so aligning closely with Germany. So the problem here was that they were having to try and persuade a lot of countries whose natural inclination was actually simply to align with Germany, to cooperate with them in what would be the basis of kind of counter forces. Okay, so they had to do this very carefully. So something like the Three Seas initiative, it's very practical. It's focused on things like infrastructure, energy cooperation, that kind of thing. And it's not explicitly as a counter to the Franco-German axis, although that's what the Polish government wants it for. And it's quite helpful when Donald Trump was president as well, because he actually supported quite a lot of these things, because he also hated the EU mainstream. So he, for example, really sort of boosted the Three Seas initiative. He spoke at the one of their kind of annual conference. So that was where they kind of tried to pursue that. But as I say, the problem with that is, that a lot of those countries didn't sort of naturally want to do anything that was obviously countering the Franco-German axis. Now, the war in Ukraine is really interesting because it's really shaken things up. Okay, it's really shaken things up. And two things have happened in terms of Poland's EU strategy. Okay, the first one is Poland's kind of moral and political capital has vastly increased. Okay, it's partly as a result of what I was talking about earlier, the fact that it's a frontline state and therefore strategically really important, but also because its critique of the EU political establishment was seen to have been correct. They basically made the right call about Putin, and in the perception of a lot of people, for example, France and Germany, through developing bilateral relations, didn't. They made the wrong call about the nature of the Putin regime. And there is some argument, I don't know how true this is, but certainly some arguments, some people argue that it was Poland's moral capital and criticisms of Germany that played a critical role in terms of Germany's kind of about turn and pledge to increase defence spending, okay, and start supplying, you know, more than just helmets to Ukraine. So on the one hand, you've got sort of, you know, Poland's sort of position has increased, and particularly over on defence issues because of its geopolitical position and also because of, you know, the political moral capital that it's got through having called Putin right. On the other hand, the political position of the Franco-German axis of the key EU players as security actors, okay, their credibility has gone down rapidly. Okay, and I mean, you can see that through, for example, the way that the United States, which originally wanted basically to do all its EU relations or its European relations through Germany, is now working very directly through Poland. Okay, and it's put aside its, you know, ideological problems with the Polish government and the fact that, you know, there were terrible relations between Poland and the United States, and now it's working very, very closely. And also, you know, a lot of these kind of post-communist states are sort of saying, well, hang on a second, you know, is Germany or the, you know, the Franco-German axis, are these really going to be credible in terms of, you know, providing security, you know, because they made completely the wrong call. And this is also an opportunity for Poland. So I think on these so I think a number of things are happening here as a result of the Ukraine conflict. Poland's credibility has been boosted. The credibility of the countries that it was trying to build, you know, that was criticizing, has gone down. And this creates all kinds of opportunities for Poland to kind of build alliances within the EU, particularly on issues like, you know, military cooperation, and also an opportunity to, as it has done with Germany, to try and sort of leverage that to try and get higher defense spending and improved military cooperation, I think. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Were there any questions? There's a hand going up from Aurelian.
Hello.
Hello.
Excuse me for not enabling my camera, but I am in Lebanon. We have some electrical cut-offs here in my country.
No problem.
So first of all, thank you a lot, Dr. Szczerbiak, for this amazing meeting. My name is Chris Said from Rennes University. I'm a PhD student in political science. I just have many questions for you, but I'm gonna stick like one or two questions. Doctor, what do you think now after the Polish and the UK security policy alignments and you know the strategies that are being done with the UK? So do you think that now Europe is gonna witness a number two or a new version of its foreign policy? For example, we're gonna witness European foreign policy with the Eastern Europe and the Western Europe, a different European foreign policy. What are we gonna see in the next maybe couple of years? It's not a matter of long time. I think that things are being done today, and this is mainly my question. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that what will happen. I mean, the EU, you know, notwithstanding sort of countless crises, has a remarkable capacity for sort of bumbling on, really, and you know, moving on from these and recovering and somehow managing to kind of stay together. There's all kind of interests that I think keep the EU acting cohesively, even if there are major differences developing. So I think that, you know, the idea of kind of, you know, two foreign policies or this being a kind of a centrifugal thing and pulling the EU apart is probably not going to happen. But I think what will happen is, I mean, my prediction here is that there will be much more vibrant debate with the post-communist states, East European states, much more assertive. Okay, in terms of I think, you know, if security issues remain important, you know, they will be they're much more receptive to the idea of, you know, speaking with a particular voice, with a single voice, and asserting their their interests much more vocally. So I think that's what's going to happen. The main EU players are really on the back foot at the moment. You know, they're extremely defensive. They're very uncomfortable in this particular situation. I mean, you know, they would really like this conflict to end, you know, as quickly as it possibly can, because while the conflict is there, you know, they're in a very difficult position. There's a lot of kind of mileage, I think, for the post-communist states I mean, it's kind of building on what I said in my talk, and Poland in particular, to really kind of assert themselves and try and shape EU foreign policy and EU defense policy. The interesting thing, I guess, is, you know, well, what will happen if I suppose there's sort of two possible scenarios where this might go. I mean, one is there is obviously a scenario whereby security issues, you know, very rapidly go down the agenda. You know, well, what kind of happens there? Well, from that point of view, I mean, you know, Germany, well, that remains the kind of the economic powerhouse. And if that's the case, well, you could then get a kind of a kind of a quick reversion to a situation where, you know, the European mainstream reasserts itself, because, you know, Germany is the economic powerhouse. As far as, you know, economic issues are important to these countries, that's where they're going to look, you know, most of them for and that's, you know, why they've really accepted German leadership a lot of the time, because they think that's the way to advance their country's economic interests. So that's obviously one possible scenario. I mean, at the moment, that doesn't look very likely. I mean, I think, you know, the war is likely to drag on, and for these countries at least, you know, security will be a, you know, absolutely top issue. But that's one possible scenario. I mean, the other thing is, you know, where does this, you know, leave the United States? I mean, at the moment, you know, the United States is kind of just ignoring really the you know, the main EU powers, and it's you know, just going to complete about face on this. So do you then, the post-communist states, feel, well, you know, now actually we've got to be much more Atlanticist really in terms of how we approach these issues, and, you know, that's going to be our sort of main security guarantor, and therefore, you know, kind of orientate these issues much more there, and almost kind of give up, if you like, on the EU. So again, that's a sort of a possible scenario. Again, I don't think that's very likely. I think what you're going to get at the moment, what's more likely, is main EU powers are on the back foot. The post-communist states, particularly countries like Poland, will use this as an opportunity to assert itself. They will push for a stronger European defense identity integrated within NATO, higher defense spending, and using the fact that, you know, they've got these countries on the back foot to try and kind of boost that. And critically, you know, greater West European involvement in NATO's eastern flanks defense infrastructure. Okay, this is really important. This is, you know, one of the reasons why you know, Britain is so popular, because, you know, it does, there are British troops there in Eastern Europe, and you know, in Poland and in the Baltic states, and obviously, you know, more of that is something that they very much want. So yeah, I think, you know, at the moment, I mean, there's obviously possible scenarios, the EU to kind of, you know, stay on the road. You're not going to have sort of two EU policies, but much more kind of open argument about it. The Eastern Europeans asserting themselves much more, at the moment at least. The EU political establishment, the mainstream Franco-German axis, finding itself on the back foot really on these kind of issues.
Thank you. We are going to let Mr. Duchesne ask a question.
Yeah. Good evening. We have seen on the one hand in the last weeks statements from top Polish or Ukrainian officials, including the Foreign Affairs Minister, calling for reinforced trilateral cooperation between the UK, Poland and Ukraine. And on the other hand, we have seen reports in Italian press, for example, that Boris Johnson was working for a kind of European Commonwealth with Poland and the UK. Do you think there is some credibility to these projects, or they are going to be less than something more than a vision?
Yeah, I think there is some credibility to these, and they're also they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, the idea of closer UK, Poland, Ukraine military cooperation is, you know, I mean, that's happening. You know, that's not just on the agenda. I mean, you know, it's actually that there is a platform in place for doing that, and then using that as the basis for, you know, then drawing in other countries into that architecture, all of which, as I say, because these are very Atlanticist countries, is complementary to the transatlantic alliance involving the United States, all of which is part of leverage to try and get countries like Germany to get more involved and spend more. I think these are very important. I mean, just specifically from the UK government's point of view, I mean, it's clear what, you know, Poland's interests are in all of this, and it's clear what Ukraine's interests are in all of this. You know, well, why is the British government doing this? You know, what's their kind of interest in it? Well, I mean, one of the arguments that the British government tried to use when they left the European Union was the fact that we are leaving the kind of the bureaucratic political structures of the EU doesn't mean that Britain is disengaging from Europe. Okay, it doesn't mean that, you know, we've kind of pulled up the drawbridge. Okay, I mean, this is the government's kind of narrative, its rhetoric. You know, the closer bilateral relations is obviously a key element of this. You know, trying to build close bilateral relations, but also I think, I mean, the military thing has always been really important because, you know, this is Britain is very conscious of the fact that, you know, it is, along with France, you know, the most serious army in Europe. That you know, the other European countries need Britain for as a kind of a provider of military security, and therefore that's something it can leverage. And in terms of kind of Britain's international image, both kind of domestically in Britain, because this is an argument that's used in Britain, you know, they're saying we're not isolationists, you know, we want a Britain that's open, well, to the world, you know, not just to Europe, but you know, but Europe in particular. And one of the ways we're going to do this is through military cooperation. Okay, so there's a, you know, a very strong incentive, a very strong strand for this to work. And as I say, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, the cooperation projects, you can have lots of them, all kind of interacting with each other. The key thing from, you know, Britain, Poland, and well, obviously Ukraine's point of view is that they're complementary to other structures. They're about getting other countries involved, about getting them to boost their military contribution, and critically keeping the United States anchored in Europe. You know, it's something that both Britain and Poland, it's been one of their sort of things that they've had in common for a long, long time. Okay, and even under, you know, different governments, I would say, you know, the strong commitment to keep the US anchored in all of this is kind of critical to security. So yeah, I think all of these projects are, I expect to see lots of these different things because it's both the Poland and the UK strategies to have, you know, lots of these overlapping cooperation platforms. In Poland's case, you know, lots of different areas, and specifically in the military.
Okay, very nice. I think we had a question in the chat. So this is from the top, Lefebvre. So understood that France and Germany credibility decreased because they are supposed to have made the wrong call in attempting to bring Putin to the discussing table. But what about the time that will necessarily come when all parties will need to sit down to work on a peace plan? Do you see the UK and Poland being in a position to re-enter into discussion with Russia? Isn't it useful to have pushy countries and more moderate countries to, on the one hand, be tough and at certain moments, and on the other hand, keep an open discussion channel, which will, whatever has been done, will have to be reopened at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, that's obviously the argument that's used by the French and German governments, and although probably not in quite as sophisticated a way as I don't know whether Emmanuel Macron and Scholz have studied game theory, but you know, so the idea of a two-level game, but in much cruder terms, I mean, that's the argument that's used. I suppose I mean, I've got two comments on that. I mean, one of them is is about trust, okay? And it's about to what extent, I mean, countries like Britain or Poland or the post-communist states might buy that argument, okay, if they could trust the non-pushy countries, whatever you want to call them, to not sell them down the river, essentially. And I think the problem at the moment is there's this perception that France and Germany are being dragged into this, kicking and screaming. They want this to finish as quickly as possible, and they want the status quo ante. Okay, that's what they want. You know, they want to go back as much as possible to the status quo ante. So I think that's the problem with it. You know, it's you know, it sounds good, it sounds very sophisticated. So you know, Poland and Ukraine and well, obviously Ukraine, but Poland and Britain talk tough. You know, while we do the while we'll go in there and we'll actually do the negotiations, we keep the lines of communications open. It makes sense as long as there is trust that you know you're not going to be betrayed. And I think there is a real problem here, which is that there is a possibility. I mean, it's also to do with domestic politics, because because already you see in Poland, for example, the government's political opponents. I mean, there's a very high level of consensus within the Polish political class over this particular issue. Okay, I mean, there's you know, there's really no sort of pro-Putin or even a sort of a Putin appeasing sort of camp at all in Poland. You know, there's no mileage in that politically. I mean, you've got tiny sort of voices, if you like. So, but the one thing they are competing over is who's the best at dealing with this. Okay, and so one of the problems that you get is you already get the opposition saying, well, why wasn't Poland involved in these talks? Okay, you know, why didn't, you know, France and Germany, why didn't they bring someone from the Polish government over to Ukraine, for example, you know? And so, you know, you've got the idea that, you know, there's always this sort of thing about, well, if they exclude us from this, our political opponents could use the fact that, you know, we're being excluded from the decision-making places, which also makes trust more difficult. Okay, now the problem, the other side of this, and this is the problem I think that Poland and the UK have, and this is where I think, you know, you are kind of onto something here, which is if you really up the ante here, okay, if you say, you know, we don't negotiate with mass murderers, okay, it then makes it very difficult to have a kind of an off-ramp, if you like, an exit strategy short of kind of regime change in Russia. Okay, it's very, very difficult, because obviously, you know, if these are, you know, war criminals, they're engaged in, you know, barbaric acts, and you don't negotiate with them. Okay, this is the British government's and the Polish government's argument. But then what's the off-ramp? Okay, you know, how do you kind of get out of the crisis? And at the very least, it's impossible. I mean, you can see the armed conflict closing, but it's very, very difficult to actually end sanctions until you've got what, you know, regime change, Russia denuding its nuclear forces to an extent that it can't threaten the West. Okay, you know, this is the corollary really of the kind of the hardline position that Poland and the UK have. So I guess that's the problem with that, you know, I say their position, you know, our position, I mean, I'm an analyst for these purposes. That's the problem with that position. It's very difficult to think of an off-ramp that doesn't, for example, involve regime change, removing Putin, and running down the Russian military to a position where they can't, you know, threaten their neighbors or indeed, you know, the West through nuclear blackmail to that extent. I think that's the problem with that. The problem, as I say, with the French and German position as it is at the moment, is that they're not trusted, essentially. The people think they're going to be betrayed, and therefore this, you know, two-level game argument is saying no, you know, it's just a way of ending the conflict, of you going back to business as usual, and for you to kind of sell us out, essentially. Okay.
Do we have another question in the chat or?
I don't think in the chat. If you have one, Ollie.
I just have I just have a question. So we saw in I think it was May or June this year that Denmark joined the Common Security and Defence Policy, kind of the EU branch military. And we've also seen Finland and Sweden apply to be part of NATO. Do you see the European Union, or indeed their common security and defence policy, taking a greater role in European defence policy, and NATO kind of relaxing from that at all? I think the big difference here is that the UK and the USA would not be involved in European defence policy.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I mean, you'd need to really be a kind of a bit more of an EU specialist to kind of really answer that question thoroughly. I mean, I can say what I think the perspective might be from the UK and Poland on that. So I think that's, I mean, these are great developments from the Polish and the UK point of view. They make it easier to kind of leverage boosting up a European defence identity, you know, which is, I mean, that's really what they want. Basically, they want European countries to spend more money, to get more integrated defence-wise. All of these things, you know, these are great. They're not against, you know, Britain is not against, you know, it's not a member of the EU, but it's not against. In fact, it's strongly in favour of European countries cooperating with each other within the EU on in defence terms. In fact, in some ways for Britain, it's quite helpful because there's fewer people to kind of negotiate. Well, this is the irony, you know. In some respects, you know, Britain is not hostile to European integration by other EU countries. They don't want to do it themselves, but you know, but for other EU countries, and in this respect, it kind of makes it easier because, you know, you've got fewer people that you have to negotiate and deal with. In terms of whether that means that then, you know, Britain and the United States, that facilitates their kind of withdrawal from European security. Well, you know, this is interesting. I mean, you know, theoretically, you could say, I mean, I'm not a military specialist, but you know, I have heard military specialists say, and they might be talking bullshit here, I don't know, but they say, well, one of the things that the Ukraine war shows is that in a conventional conflict, even without the United States, you know, Europe could basically beat Russia. You know, Russia would have no chance. They are so weak conventionally that there's actually nothing to fear, and therefore, you know, you can get America out. And I mean, the only thing to fear is obviously the nuclear element. So that remains. So, you know, theoretically, you could argue that even, you know, there is a sort of theoretical pathway. So I'm not a defense specialist, so I don't know whether that's right or not. But you know, I've heard people who, you know, are credible defense specialists say that. I think the problem with that is from the I think there are two things about it. I mean, one is certainly not the UK. The UK is not going to get not involved in European security because it's desperate to prove that, you know, it's involved in Europe and Europe needs it. Okay, so even if it doesn't, Britain is quite keen to be involved, you know, just because it's part of the narrative that, you know, we haven't involved Europe. And both of these countries, and Poland in particular, still see keeping American interest in the European continent as absolutely critical. Okay, so even if theoretically you can get to a situation where, you know, you don't need the United States militarily as a kind of a banker, as an insurance policy, you want the EU, you want the United States. I mean, and this is still the view of you know, Britain and Poland, and I can't see this changing in the foreseeable future. You know, you still need, as a banker, the United States to still be involved. Okay, so therefore, you know, there is no alternative. There can't be an alternative to NATO, even if militarily that's something that's feasible. It's not at the moment, but even if militarily it's feasible, geopolitically, you know, the United States has to be kept engaged in European security. And I think it would be a Copernican turn in Britain and the in Britain and Poland to kind of get them away from that. Atlanticism is so in the DNA of the Polish and British political establishments, in terms of certainly in terms of America as a key military security actor, that even if theoretically that was possible, that you could simply have a European defence architecture where it was unnecessary, it's going to be very difficult for countries like Britain and Poland to break from that. I don't think they're going to want to do that.
Okay, superb. Thank you very much. One more question. This is again from Lefebvre. So how far could the current UK position change, if at all, if and when Boris Johnson leaves office? Are there either small or big differences in views made by politicians on UK diplomacy in this regard?
Right. Okay. To be honest, I don't think there would be really much change in terms of this issue. I mean, Boris Johnson is very personally committed to the British involvement in the Ukraine conflict. I think there are all kinds of reasons for this. There are sort of good reasons about. I mean, the good reason is he really, honestly, insofar as he believes in anything, he really does believe in it. He thinks it's a cause that is worth fighting, and it's of a piece with his pitch, which is we're not an isolationist Britain. Britain is still very much part of Europe and playing a very constructive role and a very good role in our view. I think that there is but obviously the bad reason is that it's a very welcome distraction from his other political problems. It's very nice to have when basically a big chunk of your own party are trying to get rid of you. It's nice that there's a country in the world that's sort of naming streets after you and things like that, because you're such a hero, just a sort of personal level, but also politically. And for a time, and I don't think this washes anymore, but for a time, the argument was used, we can't get rid of our leader because you don't do this at a time of war, okay? And actually, it's interesting because early attempts to try and get rid of Boris Johnson actually floundered on that. There were some people who actually withdrew the papers that they have to submit for there to be a leadership. I think we're past that now. I don't think the war does him any good. Really, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't do him any good. Kind of domestic. I mean, if he was playing a disastrous role, and it would do him badly. But I don't think he gets any sort of real political benefit from it. And part of the reason for that is because there is a kind of a high level of continuity in terms of there's a high level of consensus, certainly within the governing camp. Okay, in terms of the Ukraine war. I mean, it's interesting to hear who his successors have been touted at. I mean, one of them is Liz Truss, who's the foreign minister, who is absolutely #1 hate figure in British politics in Moscow. I mean, they throw darts at her. Probably they hate her so much. Or another possible successor to Boris Johnson is the defence minister. Now I think the only reason for that is because he's had a very high profile and and is not very controversial, but I actually doubt if he would become the leader. But this kind of exemplifies that. But I don't think there's anyone who'd really sort of changed that policy. And interestingly, I would even go so far as to say, I mean, it's not going to be an issue because we're not going to have an election here in Britain for at least a year, probably two, possibly even. I mean, what is it scheduled for 2024? I think that's the election date when it's scheduled. I actually don't think there'd be much change if you had a Labour government, certainly not since Jeremy Corbyn was stopped being leader. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was very, very sympathetic. We'd have obviously very different policy if Jeremy Corbyn had been leader, because he's very, very sympathetic to Russia. Was very wary about condemning the Salisbury killings, for example. But I think there is a broad consensus about Eastern policy, both within the government and in terms of the political class more generally, in terms of Eastern policy. Although actually, just one thing on this, the Labour Party would strengthen voices about being more conditional about cooperation with Poland. Okay, because they're not ideological soulmates in the way that, you know, Law and Justice and the Conservatives are, and the things that where they disagree, where the Conservatives are prepared to be pragmatic about it, I think a Labour government would make greater play of this. So, you know, moral cultural issues and the rule of law stuff. I mean, they would make greater play of this. So I think that would be interesting. You know, that's something that could possibly change, because that's obviously, I mentioned that because that's the topic of our discussion. But in terms of Eastern policy, at the moment, I think we can expect, you know, very high levels of continuity on this. And actually, for all the turbulence that there is in British politics around the leadership of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, I actually think it has very little impact in terms of Britain's Eastern policy, in terms of its relations with Poland, in terms of its, you know, relations with Moscow, its analysis of what needs to be done. I think, you know, you can pretty much ignore all of that, all the sort of the Johnson stuff in terms of the subject matter of what we're dealing with today. Okay, so if that's what you're interested in, nothing's going to happen in British politics that's fundamentally going to change any of that. You know, the British policy is going to remain on very, very, you know, on the same tracks, essentially, pretty much whatever happens. Even if there's a general election, and there's not going to be one of those for, in my estimate, for a couple of years. Okay.
Okay, great. Si personne n'a pas de questions. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Szczerbiak, for the talk today, and thank you very much to everyone as well, online and here in the room as well, for offering advice and sharing your opinion. I think this will be a great topic to continue to watch as the year goes on, and hopefully in September or October we can meet up again and see if any predictions we've made have materialized. So thank you very much again, and thank you to everyone in the chat, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, it would be very nice to when the next time we meet, when we end, I won't just be sat in my kitchen on my own, but we can actually go for a drink or something like that. That would be very good. And can I just give a plug? If anybody's interested, I have a blog, a research blog on Polish politics, and it's really easy to find because you just put my name and the Polish politics blog into a search engine, and it'll come up. And I do a kind of roughly a monthly post on these kind of issues I've been talking about, and also more specifically on Polish domestic politics, if you're interested in it. So I'd just like to give that a plug. And thank you again for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure and a really interesting discussion. Thank you for your questions.
The honor was ours completely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.